This is a brief video to walk you through the overtime functionality now contained in the eForm system. Let's get started. By now you're already familiar with the weekly timesheet workflow. Timesheets are generated on Monday mornings and await employees' time throughout the week. Once sent to the supervisor for approval, they ultimately get fully approved. Now, let's take a look at what's changing. For overtime eligible employees, in a week where overtime is recorded, the system will automatically calculate the required overtime for that week and generate an automatic overtime worksheet that gets forwarded on for processing at payroll. Now, before any of that can happen, an overtime pre-approval is now required. Let's take a closer look at that. Overtime pre-approvals can be created by accessing the new application on the eForms splash page, which can be accessed at LHRIC.org/eForms. Upon entering and creating one, it's very simple to fill out. The week of is selected, hours of overtime being requested, and a brief explanation of why that overtime should be worked. Note that the week of can be either the current week, a week in the future, or a week in the past within a range. Once these fields are complete, the overtime pre-approval request is ready for processing. Two things to note. Only one overtime pre-approval is necessary per employee per week, so the system will prevent you from submitting duplicates. The number of overtime hours being requested correspond to that entire week. Once arriving at the supervisor's queue for approval, the supervisor can increase or decrease the number of hours being requested. That can also happen even after the supervisor has a chance to approve it. That way, if things change while working overtime, the supervisor always has the ability to go back and edit this. Now let's take a little bit of a closer look at the auto calculation of overtime hours. If I come into the time tracking system and open my time sheet for the week of November 23rd, and I click on the load default hours, that will populate my default hours plus the holidays and early dismissal on Wednesday the 25th. If I plug in my time for Wednesday and add in overtime that I'd be working on Friday, you'll notice that some things change quite dramatically. First, on the right-hand side, we've got 4 new columns that correspond to overtime. And below the time grid, we have overtime hours, pre-approved hours, and links to the tutorial, the overtime pre-approval system, and the overtime calculation rules. The computed overtime hours are following a sequence of rules that are explained in the overtime calculation rules link. Note that the computed overtime hours must be within a 20% range of the pre-approved overtime hours. Before being able to submit the weekly timesheet containing overtime, a few rules need to be adhered to. Number 1, an overtime pre-approval must exist for that week. Number 2, the overtime pre-approval must contain at least 80% of the hours of the actual overtime worked. And number 3, that overtime pre-approval must have been fully approved by the supervisor. Again, one thing to note, due to the practicalities in the real world, should more hours of overtime need to be worked than were previously pre-approved, you can always request that your supervisor change those hours in the pre-approval. Next, let's look at the accounting rules. For any number of overtime hours that were worked in a week, all of those hours must be attributed to 1 or more days. In this case, we're going to attribute all 9 hours of overtime to the time that was worked on Friday the 27th. In addition, district or project needs to be selected from a drop-down list, as well as category and providing a brief description of work. So for every day overtime is recorded or attributed to a day, these fields need to be selected and filled out. Once the overtime is submitted in your timesheet and approved by your supervisor, An overtime worksheet will automatically get created and sent over to payroll for payment and processing. Note, once this is done, signatures of both the employee and the supervisor carry over from the timesheet and go onto the overtime worksheet. Once the overtime worksheet is created and sent for processing, it cannot be recalled. So let's be sure and be as accurate as possible on these. And that's it. Any questions? Don't hesitate to contact your supervisor or the help desk. Thanks.